10 years is a long time, but it is never long enough to bury a lie. My ex-husband spent a decade building his empire on the ashes of my reputation. Painting himself as a saint while branding me a gold digger, he thinks tonight he will drive the final nail into my coffin, but he forgot that the man walking beside me holds the key to turning his entire career into dust. My name is Kara Windermere. I stood alone in the silence of the 45th floor, pressing my forehead against the cool, unforgiving glass of the floor-to-ceiling window that framed the sprawling, chaotic beauty of New York City in late autumn. Below me, the world was reduced to a grid of amber lights and moving shadows, a mechanical ecosystem that functioned with a logic I could understand and control. Up here, in the headquarters of Windermere and Associates, I was the architect of my own reality. I was the woman who had turned steel and glass into sanctuary, the visionary who had just secured the contract for the new municipal library in Chicago. I was safe. I was successful. I was whole. Or at least, that was what I told myself until the courier arrived 10 minutes ago. On the mahogany desk behind me, sitting innocently atop a stack of blueprints for a sustainable housing project in Brooklyn, lay a heavy cream-colored envelope. The cardstock was thick, expensive, and textured like linen. The calligraphy was embossed in gold leaf. It was a beautiful object, a testament to prestige and tradition. Yet to me, it looked like a letter bomb waiting to detonate. The Oak Haven Academy 10-year reunion. My stomach gave a violent, sickening lurch, a physical spasm that had nothing to do with what I had eaten for lunch and everything to do with the name that the invitation had not even printed, but had merely whispered into the terrified recesses of my memory. Julian Sterling. Even thinking the syllables felt like swallowing broken glass. It had been 10 years. 10 years of therapy. 10 years of rebuilding my self-esteem brick by painstaking brick. 10 years of convincing myself that the voice in my head calling me worthless, clumsy, and unimaginative was a liar. But looking at that gold script, the decade collapsed in on itself. I was not the 32-year-old CEO of an award-winning firm. I was 22 again, shivering in a drafty apartment, desperately trying to fix a rendering error while Julian stood over me, sighing with that specific, crushing disappointment that hurt worse than a scream. The ghost of my past marriage did not haunt me with chains or wailing sounds. It haunted me with the quiet, pervasive terror of inadequacy. It was the psychological imprisonment of a bird that has been told for so long its wings are broken that it refuses to fly even when the cage door is left wide open. I closed my eyes and the memories assaulted me, unbidden and sharp. I remembered the nights at Oak Haven, to the faculty and our classmates. Julian was the prodigy. He was the charismatic genius with the bold ideas and the silver tongue. I was just Kara, his quiet girlfriend, the mousy assistant who trailed behind him carrying his portfolio. They saw him presenting the dazzling final models. They never saw me at 3 a.m, my fingers stained with ink and glue, redoing his structural calculations because he had neglected the physics in favor of the aesthetic. They never saw me rewriting his thesis statement because his original draft was incoherent rambling. When he received the accolades, he would wrap an arm around my waist and smile that dazzling, predatory smile, telling everyone that I was his rock, which was his code word for his crutch. But in private, the narrative shifted. You would be nothing without me. Kara, you have no vision. You are a good technician. Sure, but you lack the spark. You are lucky I let you help me. I am giving you a purpose. I had believed him. That was the tragedy that still kept me awake at night. I had believed that my competence was merely a support system for his genius, rather than the foundation upon which his entire fraudulent reputation was built. The heavy oak door to my office opened, breaking the suffocating spell of my memory. I did not jump, but the tension in my shoulders must have been visible because the man who entered paused immediately. Elias Blackwood did not just walk into a room, he altered its atmospheric pressure. He was a man composed of deep earth tones and stillness, a stark contrast to the neon flash and noise that had defined Julian. As the CEO of Blackwood Industries, Elias commanded a global energy conglomerate worth billions, yet he carried that weight with a grace that made it look effortless. He was wearing a charcoal suit that fit his broad frame perfectly. His tie loosened slightly after a long day of negotiations. He closed the door softly, the click of the latch echoing in the large room. He did not ask what was wrong. He never asked obvious questions. He simply walked over to the desk, his eyes scanning the surface until they landed on the invitation. He read it without touching it, his expression unreadable, and then he looked up at me. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and currently filled with a concern that made my chest ache. "I thought we threw this in the recycling bin at home," Elias said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. "I told the housekeeper not to bring it to the office." "She didn't," I said, my voice sounding thin and brittle to my own ears. "This is a duplicate. The committee sent a follow-up. They really want the class valedictorian to attend." Elias walked around the desk and came to stand beside me at the window. He did not touch me immediately. He knew that when I was in this state, triggered and fragile, sudden contact could feel like a trap. He simply offered his presence, a solid wall against the wind. "And the class valedictorian is currently hyperventilating," he observed gently. "I am not hyperventilating," I lied, though my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. "I am just being rational. There is no strategic benefit to attending. It is a waste of time. I have the Brooklyn project. I have the tedious zoning meeting with the city council on Monday. I have 1,000 reasons not to go." "You have one reason not to go," Elias corrected me, turning to face me fully. "And his name is Julian." I flinched. Elias knew the history. He knew the scars. He was the one who had held me when I woke up screaming from nightmares where Julian was locking me in a glass box, telling me I was invisible. He was the one who had encouraged me to start my own firm when I was convinced I was only qualified to be a draftsperson. "He will be there," I whispered, finally admitting the terror that was clawing at my throat. I checked the alumni page. He is the keynote speaker. Elias, the keynote speaker. Can you imagine? After everything? I walked away from the window, unable to stand still, pacing the length of the Persian rug. He has been everywhere lately. Have you seen the cover of Entrepreneur Monthly? The soul of modern business. That is what they called him. He is reinventing himself as this great philanthropist, this self-made man who pulled himself up by his bootstraps. It makes me sick. He pulled himself up by standing on my neck. My hands were shaking, so I clasped them together. If I go there, he will do it again. He will spin the narrative. He has already been telling people his version of the divorce for years, that I was unstable, that I was jealous of his success, that I left him because I could not handle the pressure of being a great man's wife. If I walk into that room, I am just walking into his stage play. I will be the prop he uses to show how benevolent he is. He will look at me with that pitying smile and ask if I'm doing okay, if I manage to find a job, and everyone will look at me and see the pathetic ex-wife. Elias watched me pace, his expression darkening with a protective anger that he kept carefully leashed. He waited until I stopped moving, until I ran out of words and was left only with the ragged sound of my breathing. Then he stepped forward and took my hands in his. His palms were warm and rough, the hands of a man who built things, real things. "Kara," he said, and the way he said my name was an anchor. "Look at me." I looked up into his eyes. "You are not that girl anymore," he said firmly. "You are Kara Windermere. You built this firm from a laptop on a kitchen table to the most sought-after architectural studio in New York. You employ 40 people. You change skylines. Julian Sterling is a con artist who got lucky with a few investments and knows how to smile for a camera. His foundation is sand. Yours is bedrock." "I know that logically," I said, fighting back tears of frustration. "But emotionally? I feel like I'm about to walk into a final exam I did not study for. He knows how to push buttons I did not even know I still had." "Then go," Elias said. I blinked, surprised. "What? You just said, go," he repeated. Not for them, not to prove to the alumni of Oakhaven that you are successful. They do not matter. Their opinions are dust. Go for yourself. Go to stand in the same room as him and realize that he is small. You have built him up in your mind into a monster. Kara, but monsters disappear when you turn on the lights. Go and look him in the eye and prove to the only person who matters, you, that he does not own you anymore. He squeezed my hands. You are afraid that he will humiliate you. But humiliation only works if you value the opinion of the person speaking. Do you value Julian? I despise him, I said, the words tasting like copper. Good, Elias said, a faint, sharp smile touching the corners of his lips. Then let him talk, let him perform, and you just stand there and watch him like you would watch a bad actor in a cheap play. You are above it. I looked at the invitation again. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my gut. But beneath it, something else was kindling, a spark of anger, a spark of defiance. Why should I hide? Why should I let him chase me out of my own history? I had spent 4 years at that academy. I had worked harder than anyone. Those were my memories, too. Why should I surrender the territory just because he was occupying it? Will you come with me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elias's face tightened with regret. I have the emergency board meeting with the investors from Tokyo tonight. It has been scheduled for 3 months. If I cancel, the merger collapses. My heart sank. The thought of facing the lion's den alone made my knees weak. However, Elias continued, his voice dropping an octave, turning into a solemn vow. I will be late, but I will be there. I promise you. Kara, I will walk through those doors before the night is over. You go in first. Hold your ground. I will be the cavalry. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. You do not need me to protect you. Kara, you are formidable on your own, but I will be there to remind everyone else of who you are, just in case they have forgotten. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of him, letting his confidence seep into my pores. He was right. I was done hiding. I was done letting a 10-year-old lie define my reality. Okay, I said, the word exhaling out of me like a released valve. Okay, I will go. Elias kissed my forehead, a lingering, solid pressure. Good. Now, go home, get dressed, put on armor. An hour later, I stood in my walk-in closet at our penthouse, staring at the rows of designer garments. My hand hovered over a soft, pale pink chiffon dress. It was beautiful, safe, and unobjectionable. It was exactly the kind of dress Julian used to make me wear. Pastels soften you. Kara. He used to say, they make you look approachable, less intense. He wanted a wife who faded into the wallpaper, a decorative accessory that did not distract from his brilliance. My fingers curled into a fist, crushing the pink fabric for a second before I released it and shoved the hanger aside violently. It clattered against the wall. No, not tonight. Tonight, I was not the soft, approachable accessory. Tonight, I was the architect. I was the CEO. I was the woman who had survived a decade of silence and had screamed her name in steel and glass across the skyline. I reached further back into the closet and pulled out a garment bag I had never opened. I unzipped it, and the fabric spilled out like liquid rubies. It was a gown of deep, dark wine red, burgundy, the color of oxygenated blood, the color of royalty, the color of war. It was structured and sharp, with a neckline that demanded confidence and a silhouette that apologized for nothing. I held the dress up against my body in the full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was pale. Yes, and her eyes were wide with lingering trepidation, but as I watched, she raised her chin, the red reflected in her eyes, burning away the fear, replacing it with a cold, hard resolve. I was going to Oakhaven, and I was going to wear red. The valet at the Grand Oakhaven took my keys with a sneer that suggested my vintage convertible, while classic, did not quite meet the unspoken horsepower requirement of the evening. I ignored him, smoothed the fabric of my wine-red gown, and ascended the marble steps that led to the ballroom. The doors were massive slabs of mahogany and frosted glass, standing like the gates to a fortress where the admission fee was your dignity. I took a breath that rattled slightly in my lungs, held it for a count of 4, and pushed them open. The sensory assault was instantaneous. If my office was a sanctuary of clean lines and purposeful silence, the grand ballroom was a riot of desperate opulence. It was as if someone had taken a fire hose and sprayed gold leaf and crystal across every available surface. The chandeliers were not just lighting fixtures, they were aggressive geometric monstrosities that hung low and threateningly overhead, dripping with enough cut glass to blind anyone foolish enough to look up. The air was thick, almost viscous, composed of equal parts recycled air conditioning, the cloying sweetness of 500 expensive lilies, and the distinct, metallic tang of ambition. It smelled like money, but not the quiet, generational kind that Elias possessed. This smelled like new money, the kind that needed to scream to ensure it was being heard. I stepped onto the plush carpet, and for a heartbeat, I was invisible. Then, the ripple began. It started near the entrance, a subtle turning of heads, a pause in the clinking of champagne flutes. It spread outward like a contagion. I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes sliding over me, dissecting the silhouette of my dress, appraising the lack of jewelry at my throat. Searching for the cracks they had been promised were there. The noise in the room did not stop, but the frequency changed. The boisterous laughter and loud greetings dipped into a lower, murmuring register. The whisper network was alive and transmitting data at fiber optic speeds. I kept my chin high, channeling the structural integrity of a skyscraper in high wind. I fixed a polite, impenetrable smile on my face and began to walk toward the bar, my heels sinking slightly into the overly thick pile of the carpet. I needed water. I needed a prop. I needed to not be standing alone in the kill zone. "Kara? Is that actually you?" The voice was high, pitched with a theatrical disbelief that set my teeth on edge. I turned to see Sarah Miller, now Sarah Miller Vane, pushing her way through a cluster of tuxedos. 10 years ago, Sarah and I had shared a dorm room. We had shared secrets. She had held my hair back when I had the flu. Now, she stood before me draped in emerald silk that clashed with her skin tone, holding a martini glass like a weapon. Her eyes were not the eyes of a friend. They were the eyes of a traffic accident spectator. They were wide with a hunger for tragedy. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice surprising me with its steadiness. "It has been a long time." Sarah stopped a foot away from me, invading my personal space just enough to be uncomfortable. She scanned me from head to toe, her gaze lingering on my face as if searching for scars or ticks. "We were not sure you would come," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial stage whisper that half the room could likely hear. She reached out and touched my arm, her fingers cold and damp from her drink. "I mean, after everything Julian told us, we thought you might not be up for a crowd this size. Is it safe for you? I mean, with the anxiety?" The word hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. Anxiety. Not, "Are you okay?" but "Is your malfunction under control?" I stiffened. "I am perfectly fine. Sarah, why would I not be?" Sarah pulled back slightly, her expression shifting from fake concern to confused defense. "Oh, you do not have to pretend with me. Kara, we all know. Julian was so open about it. He told us how hard it was for him, watching you unravel like that. He said he paid for your treatment for 2 years after the divorce. That is just saintly of him. Most men would have just cut their losses. But he said he wanted to make sure you were safe before he finally moved on." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The blood drained from my face, leaving me feeling cold and exposed. He paid for my treatment. The audacity of the lie was so breathtaking, so total, that for a moment I could not speak. Julian had not paid for anything. When I left, I had $300 in a checking account and a beat-up sedan. I had worked 2 jobs while starting my firm. I had eaten instant noodles for dinner for 18 months. The therapy I eventually sought for the emotional abuse he inflicted, I had paid for that myself, session by agonizing session, but he had stolen that narrative too. He had taken my struggle, my survival, and twisted it into a story about his own benevolence. He had turned himself into the hero of my trauma. He told you that, I stated, my voice flat. Well, yes, Sarah said, blinking. At the pre-reunion mixer last night, you missed it. He gave a toast. He said his only regret was that he could not save you from your own demons, but he was so glad he could support you financially while you got back on your feet. She leaned in again, her eyes gleaming. So, did it work? The facility? You look good. A little thin, maybe, but good. I realized then the magnitude of the trap I had walked into. Julian had not just poisoned the well. He had paved over it and built a monument to himself on top. Every person in this room looked at me and saw a charity case. They saw a broken woman that their golden boy had graciously tried to fix. If I got angry, I was unstable. If I defended myself, I was ungrateful. There was no facility, Sarah, I said, carefully unpeeling her fingers from my arm. And Julian never gave me a dime. In fact, when the divorce was finalized, he kept the apartment deposit that I had paid. Sarah laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. Oh, Kara, you always had such a vivid imagination. That is what Julian loves about you, you know? He said you were always so creative with the truth. She patted my arm dismissively and turned away as someone called her name, leaving me standing there with the breath knocked out of me. It was gaslighting by proxy. He did not even have to be here to make me doubt my own reality. He had an army of flying monkeys to do it for him. I turned back to the bar, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for a glass of sparkling water. I needed to ground myself. I am Kara Windermere. I repeated in my head. I designed the Helix Tower. I restored the old Gotham Library. I am real. This is theater. Still drinking the free water. I see. I did not have to turn around to recognize the voice. It was Greg Thorne, formerly the captain of the debate team, now a corporate litigator who specialized in helping pharmaceutical companies avoid lawsuits. He slid up beside me, leaning an elbow on the bar. He was wearing a tuxedo that cost more than my first car, and he wore it with the arrogance of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Hello, Greg, I said, taking a sip of water. Hydration is important. So is a job, Greg chuckled, signaling the bartender for a scotch. He looked at me with a smirk that was half amusement, half contempt. So, what are you doing with yourself these days, Kara? Sarah said something about you dabbling in art, finger painting? Or did you finally find a guy to foot the bill so you can stay home and find yourself? The condescension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dabbling in art, find a guy. They could not conceive of a version of me that existed outside of Julian's shadow. To them, I was an accessory that had been discarded, incapable of functioning without a host. I run an architecture firm in Manhattan, I said, keeping my tone mild. Windermere and Associates. We specialize in sustainable urban renewal. Greg snorted into his scotch. Associates? Who? You and a couple of interns? Come on, Kara, you can be honest. It is just us chickens. Julian told us about the business you tried to start. He said he had to bail you out of debt 3 times before he cut you off. There is no shame in admitting you are not cut out for the Shark Tank. Some people are just meant to be supported. He looked at me with a pity that was more insulting than hatred. He genuinely believed he was being kind by telling me I was incompetent. Julian has a very active imagination, I said, my grip on the glass tightening until my knuckles turned white. My firm is doing quite well, thank you. We actually just beat out Sterling Dynamics for the city contract on the waterfront project. Greg stared at me for a second, then burst out laughing. It was a loud, booming sound that drew looks from the nearby clusters of people. Oh, wow. You almost had me there. Beat Julian? At a bid? Okay. Kara, Whatever you say to help you sleep at night, I guess denial is a powerful drug. He shook his head, still chuckling, and patted me on the shoulder as if I were a confused child. Good to see you. Kara, really, hope you find whatever it is you are looking for. He walked away, already recounting the joke to a group of men standing near a pillar. They all looked over at me and laughed. I stood frozen, a cold fire burning in my chest. It was suffocating. It did not matter what I said. It did not matter what I wore. It did not matter that my bank account balance had more zeros than Greg's annual bonus. In this room, I was trapped in a fiction that had been written 10 years ago. I was the crazy ex-wife. I was the failure. I was the punchline. I felt a sudden, desperate urge to run, to turn around, walk out those heavy doors, get in my car, and drive until I was back in the safety of my own life, where people respected me, where my signature on a blueprint meant something. Why was I here? Elias was right about facing demons, but he had not warned me that the demons would be armed with polite smiles and rewriting history. I took a deep breath and scanned the room, looking for an exit or a quiet corner where I could regroup. And then I saw him. It was impossible to miss him. Really. The entire room seemed to be orbiting around him. He was standing in the center of the dance floor, directly under the largest chandelier, as if the light was mandated by contract to shine brightest on him. Julian Sterling. He had aged, but in the way that expensive wine and regular dermatological treatments allowed a man to age. His hair was silvering at the temples, a carefully cultivated touch of distinction. He was taller than I remembered, or perhaps I had just felt so small around him for so long that my memory had shrunk. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo, midnight blue, with a silk lapel that caught the light. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid in one hand, and his other hand was gesturing expansively, punctuating a story that had the circle of admirers around him enraptured. He looked radiant. He looked like a king holding court. He looked like a man without a conscience. He threw his head back and laughed at something someone said, a full-bodied, confident sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. It was the same laugh he used to use when he charmed investors, the same laugh he used when he charmed my parents, the same laugh he used right before he would look at me with cold, dead eyes and tell me I was nothing. Seeing him there, basking in the adoration of people he secretly despised, twisting the truth into a pretzel to suit his ego. Something in me snapped. The fear did not vanish, but it crystallized. It hardened. The trembling in my hands stopped. He was so sure of his victory. He was so confident that he had crushed me, that I was just a ghost haunting the edges of his magnificent life. He thought I was here to be a cautionary tale for his audience. I set my glass of water down on the bar with a decisive click. The sound was lost in the din of the party, but to me, it sounded like a gavel coming down. I was not going to run. I was not going to hide in the bathroom. I was not going to let Greg or Sarah or anyone else drive me out. I was going to stand here. I was going to exist, and I was going to wait, because Julian was shining now, reflecting the artificial light of the chandeliers. But I knew something he did not. I knew that a storm was coming, and his name was Elias. I took a step away from the bar, moving slightly out of the shadows, and positioned myself where I had a clear line of sight to Julian. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to see the red dress. I wanted him to see that the broken woman was standing on her own 2 feet, and she was not looking at the floor anymore, as if he felt the weight of my gaze. Julian's laughter faltered for a fraction of a second. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the perimeter of his kingdom. His gaze swept over the crowd, over the waiters, over the sycophants, and then it landed on me. For a moment, across the expanse of the crowded ballroom, time seemed to suspend. The noise faded into a dull roar. It was just him and me, the predator and the prey who refused to run. A slow, oily smile spread across his face. He raised his glass in a mock salute, his eyes glittering with a cruel amusement. He had found his target. The game had begun. He did not walk toward me so much as he advanced, claiming the floor space tile by tile, The crowd that had been orbiting him shifted like a single organism, rotating to follow his trajectory. Their champagne flutes held high like torches in a procession. Julian Sterling moved with the practiced ease of a man who believed gravity was a suggestion rather than a law. He was surrounded by his usual phalanx of admirers, a mix of former classmates who had peaked in high school and new business associates who smelled of desperation and expensive cologne. They moved in a tight V formation, with Julian at the apex, cutting through the atmosphere of the room until he stopped directly in front of me. The air around him was colder, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. He looked at me, not in the eyes, but starting at my shoes, and slowly, deliberately, raking his gaze up the length of my body. It was a violation disguised as an inspection. When his eyes finally met mine, they were devoid of any human warmth. They were flat, calculating surfaces that reflected only his own ambition. "Kara," he said. His voice was smooth, a baritone that had been polished in boardrooms and practiced in front of mirrors. "I see you made it. I must admit, there was a betting pool going on about whether you would show your face." The group behind him tittered, a nervous, sycophantic sound. "Hello, Julian," I replied. I kept my hands clasped loosely in front of me, refusing to cross my arms. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me in a defensive posture. He took a half-step closer, invading the polite distance strangers usually keep. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "You look healthy," he said, the word dripping with a specific kind of condescension. "You have kept your figure. That is good. It is important to hold on to the few assets you have left. The gym must be a great way to fill all that empty time you have." The insult was precise. He was not just complimenting my appearance. He was implying that my body was the only thing of value I possessed, and that my career was non-existent. He was reducing me to an object that had been maintained, like a vintage car he had once owned. He turned slightly to his audience, gesturing to me with his glass, as if presenting a museum exhibit. "Everyone, you remember Kara, do you not? My first wife," he said first, with an emphasis that suggested draft or prototype. "We all have that one chapter in our lives, right? The learning curve. I have always wished her the best, truly, even though she lost her way after she left me. It is hard for some people to find direction without a compass." A few people nodded sympathetically. A woman I vaguely recognized as a former cheerleader made a sad, pouting face at me. "I found my direction just fine, Julian," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid hammering of my heart against my ribs. "And my compass works perfectly well now that it is not being magnetized by a narcissist." Julian laughed. It was a loud, performative bark of amusement that signaled to everyone else that they should laugh too. And they did. They laughed because he was rich, and I was the punchline. "Oh, Kara, still so feisty. It is adorable. Really." He shook his head, looking at me with mock affection. "It reminds me of the old days. Do you remember our senior year here? God, the pressure we were under." He looked around the circle, engaging his audience. "We had this massive final architectural project. Kara was drowning. She was crying every night. Panic attacks, the works. I remember staying up 3 nights in a row, doing my own work and then finishing hers, just so she could graduate. I practically glued every piece of balsa wood on her final model myself." My breath caught in my throat. The audacity of the lie was physical. It felt like a slap. I remembered those nights vividly. I remembered Julian passing out on the sofa after a party while I sat at the drafting table until dawn, correcting the structural load calculations on his bridge design because he had messed up the math. I remembered building his model because his hands were too shaky from a hangover to hold the X-Acto knife. I had graduated with honors because of my work. He had graduated because of my work. "That is a fascinating revision of history," I said, my voice cutting through the laughter. "Considering that the professors noted the distinct difference in style between our models, yours leaned heavily on flash, while mine actually stood up." Julian's smile tightened at the edges. His eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. "And," I continued, locking eyes with him, refusing to blink. "If I recall correctly, I spent those nights rewriting your thesis statement because you spelled architecture wrong on the title page. Your memory is as creative as your financial reports. Julian." The silence that followed was instantaneous and sharp. The tittering stopped. The sycophants looked between us. Sensing a shift in the wind, for a second, the mask slipped. I saw the flash of pure, unadulterated rage behind Julian's eyes, the look he used to give me right before he would throw a vase or punch a wall. But Julian was a professional. He wrestled the mask back into place within a heartbeat. He chuckled, though the sound was dry and humorless. "There it is," he said, sighing dramatically. "The bitterness. I told you all she was still angry. It is sad. Really, when you do not achieve anything in your own life. The only thing left is to try and tear down the people who have—" He turned his back on me slightly, shutting me out of the circle, addressing the group. "Speaking of reports, you would not believe the quarter we are having at Sterling Dynamics. We just closed a $50 million contract with the city for the new transit hub. $50 million. It is complex work, real work, not the kind of small-scale residential renovations Kara is probably doing to scrape by. You have to have the stomach for the big leagues. You have to understand power." He was baiting me. He was telling them I was a failure while simultaneously bragging about a contract I knew for a fact was currently under investigation for zoning violations. But I bit my tongue. I had fired my shot. I needed to save my ammunition. "It sounds impressive," Julian, a man in a velvet blazer, said, looking at Julian with awe. "You have really built an empire." "I built it from nothing," Julian declared, expanding his chest. "No handouts, no help, just grit and vision. That is something my ex-wife never understood. She wanted the lifestyle, but she did not want the grind." As he spoke, a woman detached herself from the crowd near the buffet and sashayed toward us. She was young, perhaps 24, with blonde hair styled in loose, beachy waves that looked out of place in the formal ballroom. She wore a dress that was more sequins than fabric, plunging low enough to be a hazard. Julian's face lit up when he saw her. He reached out an arm and pulled her into his side, holding her tightly. "And this," he announced, his voice booming with pride, "is Beatrice, my better half." Beatrice giggled and rested her hand on his chest. The movement was calculated to display the object on her finger. It was a diamond. A massive, vulgar, heart-shaped diamond that caught the chandelier light and refracted it in blinding sparks. It was easily 5 carats, and it looked heavy enough to sink a small boat. "Hi, everyone," Beatrice chirped. Her voice was sugary and thin. She looked at me, her eyes widening in a pantomime of recognition. "Oh, you must be the ex-wife. Julian talks about you all the time." "Does he?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, yes," Beatrice said, smiling with all her teeth. "He told me how hard it was for you. Being married to a genius is not easy, right? I mean, I just try to support him, make sure he's happy. He deserves to be happy after all the drama he went through." She twisted the ring on her finger, ensuring I saw every facet. "He gave me this last week. He said he finally wanted to be with someone who appreciated his generosity. Isn't it just huge?" "It is certainly visible from space," I replied dryly. Julian squeezed Beatrice's shoulder, looking at me with a triumphant smirk. "Beatrice understands loyalty. Kara, she understands that a relationship is about supporting the man who provides the life. She does not compete, she complements." The subtext was screaming. "I replaced you with a younger, prettier model who does not ask questions. Look at what you lost. Look at this diamond. This could have been yours if you had just learned to shut up and obey." I felt a wave of nausea. It was not jealousy. I would rather drink poison than be in Beatrice's shoes. But it was the sheer weight of his malice. He did not just want to win the breakup. He wanted to erase my identity. He wanted to parade his success and his new toy in front of me to prove that I was disposable. He was dismantling my history. brick by brick, in front of an audience of our peers. "Well," Julian said, dismissing me with a wave of his hand, "it was nice of you to stop by. Kara, feel free to grab a plate of food. I am sure you could use a decent meal. I will pick up the tab for your ticket. Consider it a donation." The group laughed again. Beatrice giggled. I stood there, the blood rushing in my ears, the urge to scream, to flip the table, to claw the smug look off his face was overwhelming. But I stood still. I let the humiliation wash over me, feeling the heat of it, the sting of it. He wants a reaction. I told myself. He wants the crazy ex-wife. Do not give it to him. But inside, I was suffocating. The walls of the ballroom felt like they were closing in. The air was too thin. I was drowning in his lies. And for a terrifying moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. I was one woman against a man who had turned the entire world into his stage. How could I possibly fight this? Julian turned his back to me completely, resuming his conversation with the man in the velvet blazer, effectively erasing me from existence. Beatrice cast one last pitying look over her shoulder before snuggling closer to him. I was alone in the crowd again, but this time I felt stripped bare. He had marked me. He had defined me. And he had done it without raising a fist. I took a slow step back, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. I needed air. I needed to think, but mostly, I needed to survive the next hour without shattering into the million pieces he was so desperate to see. When Julian finally turned his back to me to head toward the stage for his preparations, the vacuum he left behind was not one of relief. It was a void that was immediately filled by something far more suffocating. As long as he had been standing there, the aggression was focused, a singular beam of malice I could track and parry. But the moment he walked away, the hostility diffused. It became atmospheric. It seeped into the air conditioning. It settled on the rims of the champagne flutes. I stood alone in the middle of the room, a singular island of crimson in a sea of black tuxedos and neutral cocktail dresses. The physical space around me cleared. People did not just ignore me. They actively avoided me, creating a 3-foot perimeter of exclusion that followed me wherever I turned. But while their bodies moved away, their eyes remained fixed. I felt the gaze of the room like a physical weight pressing against my skin. It was the sensation of being dissected by 1,000 dull scalpels. The ambient noise of the party, which had been a roar of conversation, seemed to sharpen into distinct, weaponized frequencies. I did not need to strain my ears to hear what they were saying. The whispers were not meant to be private. They were meant to be overheard. They were part of the punishment. She has no shame coming here. I heard she tried to sue him for alimony 3 times. Gold digger, leech, traitor. The words floated through the air like toxic spores. I looked around, searching for a friendly face, a neutral face, anything other than this wall of judgment. But everywhere I looked, I saw the same expression. It was a look of righteous indignation. To them, I was not a person. I was a villain in the hero's journey of Julian Sterling. I was the obstacle he had overcome. My presence here was an insult to their idol. I started to move toward the edge of the room, my legs feeling heavy and numb, when a figure stepped directly into my path. It was Rick Halloway. In college, Rick had been Julian's roommate. He had been the one who drove me to the emergency room when I had appendicitis because Julian was too busy with a fraternity pledge event. I had once considered him a friend. Now, he stood before me with his hands in his pockets, rocking back on his heels, looking at me with a sorrowful, patronizing shake of his head. "Rick," I said, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. "It is good to see you." Rick did not smile. He looked at me with the weary disappointment of a parent scolding a toddler who had just set fire to the curtains. "Is it Kara?" he asked. His voice was low, intimate, designed to make me feel small. "Because honestly, seeing you here is painful. For all of us." I blinked, confused. "Painful? Why?" "Do not play coy," Rick sighed, stepping closer so his voice could drop to a conspiratorial murmur. We all know what you did. Julian is too much of a gentleman to say the details out loud, but he told me everything. He told me about the affair. The floor seemed to drop out from under me. What? The affair. Kara, Rick said, his voice hardening. The personal trainer? Or was it the tennis instructor? Julian said you ran off with him the moment the startup money ran dry. He said he came home and found the apartment empty, the joint account drained, and a note saying you were leaving him for someone who could show you a better time. My mouth fell open. The lie was so monstrous, so completely inverted from the truth, that my brain struggled to process it. Rick, that is insane, I stammered, my voice rising in panic. There was no affair. There was no trainer. I left because he was emotionally abusive. And the money? He drained the account. He took my savings, $20,000 that I had inherited from my grandmother, to fund the first prototype for Sterling Dynamics. I left with nothing. Rick laughed. It was a short, sharp sound of disbelief. God, you are good. You almost sound like you believe it. But come on, Kara, look at him. He gestured toward the stage where Julian was chatting with the dean. Does that look like a man who steals $20,000 from his wife? He is a visionary. He is a billionaire. And you? You are the woman who broke his heart when he was vulnerable. He leaned in, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and self-righteousness. If you had any decency, you would go up there and apologize to him, give him some closure. He spent 2 years in therapy getting over the betrayal. You owe him that. I stared at Rick, realizing with a cold, dawning horror that nothing I said would matter. Julian had not just lied. He had constructed a fortress of falsehood so elaborate, so detailed, that the truth looked like madness in comparison. He had accused me of the very financial theft he had committed. He had projected his own infidelity. I knew about the secretaries, the interns, onto me. He had stolen my grievance and worn it like a costume. I do not owe him anything, I whispered, my voice trembling with rage. And I certainly do not owe you an explanation. Rick stepped back, his face closing off. Fine, have it your way, but do not expect anyone here to welcome you. We look out for our own, and you made it very clear 10 years ago that you were not one of us. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking. I needed to get out of the center of the room. I felt exposed, flayed open. I spotted a group of women near the dessert table. Emily, Jessica, and Chloe. We had been in the same art history seminar. We had studied together. Surely, they would listen. Surely, the sisterhood meant something. I approached them, forcing a smile onto my stiff lips. Hi, guys, I said. The conversation stopped instantly. 3 pairs of eyes turned to me. There was no warmth, only a chilly, anthropological curiosity. Kara, Emily said. She did not make room for me in the circle. I just wanted to say hello, I said, feeling the desperation clawing at my throat. And I know what Julian has been saying, about the cheating, about the money. It is not true. You have to believe me. You knew me. You know I would never do that. Chloe took a sip of her wine, looking over the rim of the glass with eyes that were hard as flint. We know people change, Kara. Money changes people, or rather, the lack of it does. I did not care about the money, I insisted, my voice cracking. I supported him. I worked 2 jobs. Julian said you felt entitled to his success before he even earned it, Jessica chimed in, her tone bored. He said you were constantly threatening to leave him if he did not buy you things. Frankly, it sounds exhausting. I do not know how he put up with it for so long. He is lying. I wanted to scream it, but it came out as a strangled hiss. Why would I be here if I was the one who betrayed him? Why would I show my face? For attention? Emily suggested, shrugging. Or maybe you heard about the IPO and you are looking for a payout. It is sad. Kara, he is happy now. Beatrice is lovely. She supports him. Why can you not just let him be happy? They turned their backs on me, resuming their conversation about a ski trip to Aspen, effectively sealing the wall between their reality and mine. I stood there, staring at the back of Emily's silk dress, and I realized the terrifying power of a charismatic narcissist. The truth did not matter. Facts did not matter. What mattered was the story. Julian told a story that validated their world. A story where men are noble geniuses and women are grasping harpy parasites. They believed him because they wanted to believe him. Believing me would mean acknowledging that their golden boy was a monster and that the world was unfair. It was easier to make me the villain. The walls of the ballroom began to spin. The heat was unbearable. I could feel the tears pricking at the back of my eyes. Hot and stinging. I could not cry here. I would not cry here. That would be the final victory for him. I turned and walked as fast as my heels would allow toward the double doors of the ladies' room. I pushed through them and stumbled into the sanctuary of the restroom. It was empty, thank God. The lighting was harsh and clinical, reflecting off the white marble and gold fixtures. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white, and stared at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked terrified. Her skin was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. The red dress, which had felt like armor in my apartment, now felt like a target. "Pull yourself together," I hissed at my reflection. "You are a CEO. You are an architect. You are not this." But the voice in my head, the voice that sounded like Julian, whispered back, "Look at you. No one believes you. You are alone. You have always been alone." Where was Elias? I checked my watch. It was 8:30. He had said he would be late, but how late? The board meeting could drag on for hours. What if he did not come? What if I had to walk out of here alone, past the sneers, past the judgment, carrying the weight of a labeled adulterer and thief? The thought made my knees weak. I splashed cold water on my face, heedless of the makeup, trying to shock my system back into functionality. I grabbed a paper towel and patted my skin dry. Taking deep, shuddering breaths. You do not need him to save you, I told myself, echoing Elias's words. But God, I need him to stand beside me. I was about to leave when the door to the restroom swung open. I ducked into the nearest stall and locked it. My heart hammering. I could not face anyone else right now. I just needed a minute of silence. 2 women walked in. The click-clack of their heels on the marble floor was sharp and aggressive. "Did you see her dress?" a voice asked. It was high, sugary, and unmistakably cruel. "Beatrice." "I know," another voice answered, one of the sycophants I had seen fawning over Julian earlier. "Red. At a reunion. It screams, 'Look at me. I am desperate.'" Beatrice giggled. I could hear the sound of her applying lipstick, the soft pop of her lips. "Julian said she always had bad taste. He said she used to try and decorate their apartment with trash she found at flea markets and call it vintage. He barely tolerated it." I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle the gasp of indignation. My trash had been mid-century modern pieces I had restored by hand. They were now worth thousands. "Is he nervous?" the friend asked. "About her being here?" "Julian? Nervous?" Beatrice scoffed. "Please, he is thrilled. He told me this is going to be the highlight of the night. He has a special section of his speech dedicated just to overcoming toxic anchors. He is going to destroy her, Tina, completely." My blood ran cold. "Really?" Tina asked, sounding excited. "Like, call her out by name?" "Better," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a gleeful whisper. "He has a slideshow. He dug up some old photos of when she was, in the bad place, when she stopped showering, when she gained all that weight from the depression meds. He is going to show everyone what he had to deal with. He is going to contrast it with his success. It is going to be a massacre." I felt the bile rise in my throat. Photos. He had photos from the darkest period of my life, the months after my mother died, when I was sinking into a depression that he had mocked rather than helped me through. He was going to put those on a screen. He was going to project my vulnerability, my pain, my lowest moments onto a 20-foot screen for these wolves to devour. "God, that is brutal," Tina said. though she sounded like she was smiling. "She is going to leave in tears." "That is the plan," Beatrice chirped. "Julian says it is the only way to make sure she never tries to come back. We have to fumigate the past to build the future, right? Anyway, let's go. I want a front row seat for the show." The door opened and closed. Silence returned to the restroom, but it was a ringing, deafening silence. I sat on the closed toilet lid, trembling. This was not just social ostracization. This was an execution. Julian was not content with me simply being gone. He wanted to scorch the earth where I stood. He wanted to strip me of every shred of dignity I had rebuilt over the last decade. I looked at the lock on the stall door. It would be so easy to stay here. I could wait until the speech started, then sneak out the side exit. I could call my driver. I could go home, curl up in my bed, and never think about Oakhaven again. No one would blame me. It was a slaughter. But then I thought about the photos. I thought about the girl in those photos, the sad, broken girl who had believed she was worthless because a man told her so. If I ran now, I was abandoning her. I was letting Julian rewrite her history forever. I was letting him turn her pain into a prop for his ego. A cold, hard rage began to crystallize in the pit of my stomach, displacing the fear. It started as a small knot and expanded until it filled my lungs, my veins, my fingertips. No, I stood up. I smoothed the skirt of my wine-red dress. I checked my face in the mirror one last time. My eyes were not glassy anymore. They were burning. I was not going to run. Let him show the photos. Let him tell his lies. But he was going to have to do it while looking me in the eye. I would be a witness to his cruelty, and my presence would be the testimony that condemned him. I walked out of the restroom, the doors swinging wide before me. The hallway seemed longer than before, the air heavier. I walked back into the ballroom. The lights had dimmed slightly. The crowd was beginning to drift toward the stage. Their faces turned upward in anticipation, like worshippers at an altar. I did not join the throng in the center. I moved to the side, finding a spot near a large marble pillar. It was shadowed, obscured from the casual glance, but it offered a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the podium. I crossed my arms, not in defense this time, but in judgment. I planted my feet firmly on the carpet. I was a statue. I was a sentinel. I waited for the monster to take the stage, and I prayed, with a fervor that bordered on desperation, that the storm named Elias would break before the damage was irreversible. But even if he did not, even if I was the last soldier standing on the battlefield, I would not retreat. The lights in the ballroom dimmed, descending from a blinding brilliance to a hushed, theatrical twilight. The conversation died out, replaced by the collective rustle of silk and wool as 500 bodies turned toward the stage. A single spotlight cut through the darkness, a cone of pure white illumination that captured the man of the hour. Julian Sterling stepped into the light, microphone in hand, with the practiced casualness of a man who had rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror 1,000 times. He did not look like a former classmate attending a reunion. He looked like a Messiah addressing his disciples. He waited for the silence to become absolute, letting the anticipation build until it was a physical pressure in the room. Then, he smiled. It was a humble, self-deprecating smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes perfectly. "Friends," he began, his voice warm and resonant, amplified by the high-quality sound system to reach every corner of the vast hall. "When I look out at this room tonight, I do not see faces. I see history. I see the shared DNA of our youth. We walked these halls together. We dreamed in the library. We panicked before finals." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. He had them. Within 30 seconds, he had established a bond of intimacy. "I have been asked to speak tonight about success," Julian continued, pacing slowly across the stage, the spotlight tracking him obediently. "About how Sterling Dynamics grew from a garage startup to a multinational corporation. About the contracts, about the headlines. But honestly, That is the boring part. The numbers are just numbers. The real story, the story I never tell, is about the cost. He stopped center stage and lowered his head slightly, his expression shifting from celebratory to somber. We live in a culture that celebrates the harvest, but ignores the fertilizer, he said, using a metaphor that sounded profound if you did not think about it for more than 2 seconds. We see the summit, but we do not see the dead weight we had to cut loose to climb there. And tonight, I want to be honest with you. I want to be vulnerable. I stood by my pillar, my fingernails digging into the velvet of my clutch. I knew that tone. That was the tone he used when he was about to rewrite reality. 10 years ago, Julian said, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced everyone to lean in. I was a young man with a vision. I had the blueprints for a renewable energy grid that could revolutionize the tri-state area. I had the drive, I had the passion, but I also had an anchor. He paused for effect. I was married young, he said, and the room seemed to hold its breath. I was a romantic. I believed that love could conquer all. I believed that if I just gave enough of myself, I could save someone who was drowning. But I learned a hard lesson that year. You cannot save someone who falls in love with their own victimhood. He did not say my name. He did not have to, like a synchronized swimmer performance. Heads began to turn. First a few, then a dozen, then a wave. They looked from the stage to the shadows where I stood. I felt the heat of their gaze like a physical burn. I kept my chin high, but my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I tried, Julian said, his voice cracking with a manufactured emotion. God knows I tried. I worked 18-hour days to build the company, and I would come home to chaos, to emotional instability, to demands that I could not meet. There is a specific kind of pain in realizing that the person you are building a future for is actively dismantling the foundation while you sleep. He was painting a picture of a madwoman in the attic, a burden he had heroically carried. I remember one night in particular, Julian said, looking out into the middle distance, as if recalling a tragic memory. It was the winter of 2016. Sterling Dynamics was on the brink of bankruptcy. We needed capital for the final prototype. Every cent I had was in that machine. And then I found out about the debt. My eyes widened. The debt? What was he talking about? I came home early, Julian continued, and I found the letters, gambling debts, online poker, credit cards maxed out on luxury goods to fill a void that no amount of money could ever fill. $35,000, I gasped. The sound was involuntary, strangled in my throat. $35,000? That was the exact amount of the initial loan I had taken out in my name to pay for his server space. I had taken the risk. I had signed the papers because his credit score was in ruins after he defaulted on a car payment. He was inverting the story completely. I had a choice, Julian said, opening his hands helplessly. I could let her face the consequences. I could let the sharks come for her. But I couldn't do it. She was my wife. So I did the only thing I could do. I sold my car. He looked down at his shoes, humble and defeated. It was a 1967 Mustang. My father left it to me. It was the only thing I owned that had any sentimental value. I sold it to a collector in Jersey the next morning. I took the cash, and I paid off her debts, every single penny. That is a lie, I whispered. But the words died in the heavy air of the ballroom. I remembered the Mustang. He had crashed it while driving drunk 3 months after we married. The insurance payout had gone into his pocket. I was the one who sold my Toyota Corolla, my only means of transportation to work, to keep us from being evicted. I had taken the bus for 2 years in the freezing rain while he took Ubers on the company card. I drove a rental for 3 years, Julian said, a sad smile touching his lips. But I told myself it was worth it. If it bought her peace of mind, it was worth it. But you know the tragedy of addiction? It is a black hole. You throw everything you have into it, your money, your love, your self-respect, and it just demands more. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. A low murmur of sympathy rippled through the crowd. "Poor Julian," someone whispered loud enough for me to hear. "He is such a good man." I felt dizzy. The room was spinning. This was not just a lie. It was a masterpiece of character assassination. He was stealing my sacrifice and wearing it as a badge of honor. He was taking the very moments where I had bled for him and using them to paint himself as a martyr. "I do not tell you this to shame anyone," Julian said, his voice regaining its strength. "I tell you this because I know many of you are on your own journeys to success, and you need to know that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go. I had to learn that I was not a savior. I was a hostage." He looked up, his eyes locking directly onto mine across the room. There was no pretense now. He was staring straight at me, and he invited the entire room to follow his gaze. "It took me years to rebuild," he said. "To rebuild my finances, to rebuild my trust in people, but look at where we are now." He gestured to the opulent room, the chandeliers, the trappings of wealth. "We made it. And we made it because I finally found a partner who runs beside me, not one who drags behind me." He gestured to Beatrice, who was standing in the front row, beaming and clutching her diamond hand to her chest. The crowd applauded politely, but their attention snapped back to him, and to me, instantly. "So," Julian said, raising his glass. The spotlight flared on the crystal. "I want to propose a toast." He took a step toward the edge of the stage, looming over the audience. "To the past," he said, his voice hard and clear. "May it stay buried, and to those we left behind." He paused. A cruel, deliberate silence. He tilted his glass directly toward me. His eyes were cold, dead, and triumphant. "I hope," he said, "that wherever they are, whatever they are doing, they finally learn the one lesson I tried so hard to teach them, how to stand on their own 2 feet. Because in the real world, Kara, you cannot rely on a man to bail you out forever. Eventually, you have to pay your own tab." The use of my name was a slap in the face. It was a direct violation of the social contract. He had named the villain. "To independence," Julian concluded, taking a sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "To independence," the crowd echoed. The sound was a roar. Applause broke out, thunderous and validating. They were cheering for him. They were cheering for the man who had supposedly sold his father's car to save his gambling wife. They were cheering for his strength in cutting off the dead weight. I stood frozen by the pillar. I felt stripped naked. Every eye in the room was on me. But they were not seeing Kara Windermere, the architect. They were seeing the caricature Julian had drawn. They saw a leech. They saw a failure. They saw a woman who had squandered the love of a great man. My face burned with a mixture of shame and white-hot fury. The injustice of it was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like ash and bile. I wanted to scream. I wanted to storm the stage and tear the microphone from his hand and tell them about the nights I held him while he cried because he felt like a fraud. I wanted to tell them about the eviction notices. I wanted to tell them about the emotional abuse, the way he would give me the silent treatment for days if I didn't praise his mediocre sketches. But I knew, with a sinking, terrible certainty, that it wouldn't matter. If I screamed, I was the unstable ex-wife. If I cried, I was the manipulative victim. He had checkmated me before I even moved a pawn. Julian stood on the stage, basking in the applause, looking down at me with a smirk that was visible only to me. It was a smile that said, "I told you, you are nothing without me. I own your past, and I just destroyed your present." The applause began to fade into a buzzing chatter as people turned to their neighbors to dissect the drama. I could see them pointing. I could see the judgment etched into their faces. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the trembling in my legs. I had promised myself I would not run. I had promised Elias I would hold my ground, but the ground felt like quicksand. "Stand on your own 2 feet," he had said. I looked down at my heels. Planted firmly on the expensive carpet, I was standing. I was here. I had built a company that rivaled his without stealing a dime from anyone. I had paid my own way. The truth was a fortress inside me, but right now, it was a fortress under siege, and the walls were beginning to crack. I needed him to stop looking at me. I needed the light to move, but Julian was not done. He signaled to the tech crew, and the large screen behind him flickered to life. "And just to show how far we have come," Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper again. I wanted to share a few memories from the archive, before the success, when things were dark. My heart stopped. The photos. Beatrice had been right. He was going to do it. He was going to show the world the face of my depression and call it his burden. I gripped the cold marble of the pillar. This was it. This was the execution. I braced myself for the impact, watching the screen as the first image began to resolve from the pixels. I was about to be destroyed, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. The applause that followed Julian's speech did not sound like appreciation to me. It sounded like a landslide. It was a roar of approval that crashed against my eardrums, physically painful and terrifyingly absolute. Every clap of a hand was an agreement with his version of history, a signed contract that validated his sainthood and confirmed my villainy. The sound wrapped around my throat, tighter than a noose, choking off the oxygen until my lungs burned with the effort of simply existing. I felt the nausea rise, a hot, acidic tide in my stomach. It was the visceral reaction to a reality so distorted that my brain could not reconcile it. I was standing there, the woman who had worked 3 jobs, the woman who had built a skyscraper, the woman who had survived, and yet 500 people were cheering for the man who had tried to bury me. It was not just unfair, it was a violation of the laws of physics. It felt like watching gravity work in reverse. I took a stumbling step back, my shoulder hitting the cold marble of the pillar. I needed to anchor myself. I needed to feel something solid before I dissolved completely into the fiction they had created. But the room would not let me retreat. As the applause began to die down, settling into a murmur of admiration, the circle of isolation around me broke. But it did not break with kindness. It broke with a sickening, performative pity. A woman I barely recognized, perhaps a friend of a friend from the debate team, drifted toward me. She held a glass of white wine and looked at me with eyes that were wet with borrowed emotion. "Kara," she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that made my teeth ache. "I just wanted to say you are so brave." I blinked, my vision blurring slightly. "Brave?" "For coming here," she clarified, nodding solemnly. "After everything you put him through, it takes a lot of guts to face a man you hurt like that. You are so lucky he is such a gentleman. Most men would have had security throw you out. But Julian? He even toasted to your independence. That is grace, Kara. That is pure grace. I hope you appreciate it." She patted my arm, a touch that felt like a brand, and walked away, feeling virtuous for having spoken to the pariah. I stood there, mouth agape, unable to form a rebuttal. The gaslighting had been so effective that even my presence here was being twisted into a testament to his character. Not mine. Then came the others. They did not speak to me directly, but they made sure I heard them. They were the vultures circling the carcass of my reputation. "It is sad. Really," a man in a gray suit muttered to his companion as they passed me, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Some women just cannot handle a man with ambition. She probably just wanted a pet, not a partner." "I heard she is still single," the companion replied, casting a sneering look in my direction. "Makes sense. Who would want to take on that kind of baggage after hearing that speech? Julian is a saint for putting up with it as long as he did." I felt the walls of my psychological defense crumbling. The armor of the red dress, which had felt so impenetrable an hour ago, now felt like a costume. I felt foolish. I felt small. I felt exactly how Julian wanted me to feel, like a fraud who had been caught. I looked toward the bar, desperate for an exit route, and that was when I saw Rick and Beatrice. They were standing 10 feet away, watching me with undisguised glee. Rick was leaning against the counter, shaking his head with a mock disapproval that was clearly designed for an audience. "Unbelievable," Rick said, projecting his voice so it carried over the ambient noise. "You have to wonder about the lack of self-awareness. If I had done what she did to Julian, the lying, the stealing, the cheating, I would have moved to another continent. But to come here? To wear that dress? It is not just bold, Beatrice, it is shameless." Beatrice giggled, the sound sharp and grating. She covered her mouth with her diamond-clad hand, her eyes dancing with malice. "Maybe she thinks if she stands there long enough, we will all forget. Or maybe she is hoping Julian will give her another loan, for old time's sake." "Right," Rick snorted, "because the first $35,000 was not enough. Some people are just black holes. B. They take and they take until there is nothing left." Their laughter was the final blow. It was not the loud, boisterous laughter of the crowd. It was intimate, cruel, and dehumanizing. It stripped away the last layer of my resolve. I looked at my hands. They were shaking so violently that I had to drop my clutch to stop from dropping it. My breath was coming in short, ragged gasps. The room was too hot. The lights were too bright. The smell of expensive perfume was suffocating. "Elias is not coming," the voice in my head whispered. It was a cold, rational voice. "He is stuck in a board meeting. He has a company to run. He cannot save you from this. You were stupid to think you could walk into the lion's den alone. You are not a phoenix. Kara, you are just a bird with clipped wings, hopping around in the dirt while they throw stones." I was going to lose. I had already lost. The narrative was set in concrete. 10 years of hard work, of therapy, of building a life. It was all gone in 20 minutes of charismatic lying. To these people, I would always be the crazy ex-wife. I would always be the villain. I could not breathe. I needed to leave. I needed to get to my car, lock the doors, and drive until I found a place where the name Julian Sterling did not exist. I bent down, snatched up my clutch with trembling fingers, and turned toward the double doors. My movements were jerky, uncoordinated. I kept my head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone, focused entirely on the brass handle of the exit. It was 50 feet away. It felt like 50 miles. "Just walk." I commanded my legs. 1 step, 2 steps. Get out now." I had made it halfway across the room. The crowd had parted slightly, allowing me a path of shame. I was almost there. I could almost feel the cool night air on my skin. "Kara?" The voice boomed through the speakers, stopping my heart in my chest. It was not a question. It was a command. I froze, every muscle in my body locked up. I did not turn around. I could not. "Kara, wait." Julian's voice echoed, dripping with a faux concern that sounded like oil slicking over gravel. "You are not leaving already, are you? We are just getting to the best part." The room went silent. The background chatter cut off as if a switch had been flipped. 500 heads turned. Half of them looked at Julian on the stage. The other half looked at my back. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. "Please, just let me go. You won. You destroyed me. Just let me leave." "I know this is difficult for you," Julian continued, his voice soft, reasonable, the voice of a disappointed parent addressing a truant child. "Hearing the truth is never easy, but running away, again? Is that really how you want to be remembered? As the woman who runs away when things get real?" He was goading me. He was cornering a wounded animal, poking it with a stick, waiting for it to snap. He knew exactly what he was doing. If I walked out now, I was the coward. I was the guilty party fleeing the scene of the crime. But if I turned around and screamed at him, if I let the rage that was boiling in my blood erupt, I would look exactly like the unstable, hysterical woman he had painted me to be. It was a perfect trap, a masterclass in manipulation. "Come on, Kara," Julian urged, and I could hear the smirk in his voice. "Do you not have anything to say? No defense? No apology? Or are you finally, for the first time in your life, too ashamed to speak. The word ashamed hit me like a physical blow. Ashamed? I had spent 10 years being ashamed. Ashamed of staying with him, ashamed of letting him belittle me, ashamed of believing him when he said I was worthless. I had clawed my way out of that shame with bloody fingernails, and now he was trying to put me back in the box. Slowly, painfully. I turned around. Julian was standing at the edge of the stage, the microphone held loosely in his hand. He looked immense. He looked untouchable. The screen behind him was frozen on a grainy photo of me from 10 years ago, sitting on a park bench, wearing sweatpants, looking hollowed out and exhausted. It was a photo taken the day after my mother's funeral. He was using my grief as evidence of my incompetence. I looked at him, and for a terrifying second, I saw nothing but my own defeat. I was alone. There was no one in this room who was on my side. I was a singular point of failure in a room full of success. I started to speak, but my voice failed me. It was a dry, raspy croak. Julian cupped a hand to his ear, mocking me. I am sorry. We cannot hear you. Speak up, Kara. Or did you lose your voice along with your dignity? The crowd chuckled. A low, cruel sound. I stood there, trembling, my red dress feeling like a target painted on my body. The tears were coming now, hot and humiliating, blurring my vision. I was going to break down. I was going to cry in front of him, and he was going to win. The despair was a black pit opening up beneath my feet, and I was falling into it. There was no bottom. There was only Julian's laughter and the weight of 1,000 judgments. I closed my eyes, waiting for the impact, waiting for the final humiliation, and then the world shifted. It started as a sound, a heavy metallic clank of the locking mechanism on the main double doors engaging, followed by the groan of heavy hinges. But it was not a normal opening. The massive mahogany doors to the grand ballroom did not just open. They were thrown wide with a force that sent a shockwave through the room. Bang! The sound was like a gunshot. It cut through the tension, through the mockery, through Julian's smug monologue. A gust of wind swept into the room. Cold, crisp, and smelling of rain and ozone. It was a violent intrusion of the outside world into this hermetically sealed bubble of malice. The candles on the tables flickered wildly. The heavy velvet drapes swayed. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop instantly. Every single sound in the ballroom died. The laughter choked off. The whispers vanished. The silence that descended was absolute, heavy, and terrified. Everyone turned. 500 pairs of eyes ripped themselves away from the spectacle of my destruction and fixed on the entrance. I turned too, my breath catching in a sob I had not yet released. Framed in the doorway, blocking out the light from the hotel corridor, stood a silhouette. He was massive. The backlight made it impossible to see his features at first, rendering him as a towering void of darkness against the light. But you did not need to see his face to feel the power radiating from him. It was a physical force, rolling off him in waves. He stood with his feet planted wide, his shoulders filling the frame, his posture not just confident but predatory. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark, tailored overcoat that swirled around his legs in the draft. The collar turned up against the wind. He looked like a storm that had decided to take human form. He did not move. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the room feel the weight of his arrival. On the stage, Julian lowered the microphone. His smile faltered. For the first time all night, the arrogance slipped from his face, replaced by a flicker of confusion and a primal, instinctive unease. The figure in the doorway took one step forward. The sound of his dress shoe hitting the marble floor echoed like a hammer strike in the silent room. Step. Then another. Step. He walked out of the shadows and into the periphery of the chandelier's light. The illumination caught the sharp, angular line of his jaw, the stern set of his mouth, and the eyes that were currently burning with a cold, terrifying fire that made Julian's malice look like a child's tantrum. It was Elias. But it was not the gentle, patient husband who had held my hand in the kitchen this morning. This was the Titan. This was the man who crushed competitors before breakfast and toppled monopolies for sport. This was the Elias Blackwood who the business world feared, and he was looking at the room not as a guest, but as an executioner who had just arrived to read the sentence. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the stage. His eyes swept the room with laser precision until they locked onto me, and in that split second, the terrifying coldness in his face vanished, replaced by a look of such fierce, possessive recognition that my knees almost gave out. He had come. He was late. He was terrifying, but he was here, and as he began to stride toward me, parting the crowd like the Red Sea without saying a word, I realized with a jolt of electricity that the victim narrative was about to end. The predator on the stage had just become the prey. The heavy mahogany doors slowly swung shut behind him, sealing the room once more, but the atmosphere had been irrevocably altered. If the ballroom had previously felt like a shark tank where I was the bleeding bait, it now felt like a cathedral where a deity had just entered, demanding silence and submission. Elias Blackwood did not walk. He advanced. He moved with a terrifying, fluid grace that made the frantic energy of the party seem childish and desperate. He was not wearing a tuxedo. In a sea of men wearing rented penguin suits or flashy, sequined dinner jackets designed to catch the strobe lights, Elias wore a charcoal three-piece suit that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. It was cut with a precision that defied geometry, tailoring that made him look broader, taller, and more substantial than any other man in the room. There were no logos. There were no diamond cufflinks. There was no visible watch face encrusted with gems. His attire whispered a level of wealth that Julian and his cohorts could not even comprehend. The kind of wealth that does not need to shout, because it owns the building the shout is echoing in. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat as he walked, the movement casual yet commanding, revealing the stark white of his dress shirt against the dark vest. He did not look left. He did not look right. He did not acknowledge the 500 people who were staring at him with their mouths agape. The crowd, which had formed a dense, suffocating wall around me, began to dissolve. It was a physical reaction, instinctive and immediate. As Elias approached the center of the room, people scrambled to get out of his path. They spilled their drinks, stepped on each other's toes, and pressed themselves against the tables to create a wide, clear avenue for him. It was the way a herd of gazelles parts for a lion, not out of politeness, but out of a primal recognition of the top of the food chain. I watched him come. My heart, which had been beating a frantic, erratic rhythm of panic, suddenly slowed into a heavy, powerful thud. He was here. He was actually here, on the stage. The transformation of Julian Sterling was a study in psychological whiplash. The microphone was still in his hand, but it hung limp at his side. The smirk that had been plastered on his face, that cruel, triumphant sneer, had vanished. In its place was a look of dawning, horrified recognition. Julian knew who this man was. Of course he did. Julian had a subscription to every business journal in the country. He had likely pinned photos of Elias Blackwood to his vision board. He had likely quoted him in his morning affirmations. He was looking at his idol, the man he pretended to be when he looked in the mirror, and he was realizing with a sinking stomach that the Titan had just walked into his personal kingdom. Elias did not even glance at the stage. To him, Julian was furniture. To him, the man who had just spent 20 minutes dissecting my soul was nothing more than background noise. Elias's eyes were fixed solely on me. Across the expanse of the carpet, his gaze locked onto mine, and the terrifying coldness that had frozen the room melted instantly. The hard lines around his mouth softened. The predator vanished, replaced by the husband. He saw the red dress. He saw the way I was clutching my purse. He saw the unshed tears shimmering in my eyes. He closed the distance between us in long, purposeful strides. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of me, invading my personal space in the most comforting way possible. He was a wall of warmth and scent, cedarwood, old paper, and rain. blocking out the rest of the world. "I am sorry I am late," he said. His voice was not shouted. He did not use a microphone, but the timbre of his voice was so rich, so deep, that it carried to every corner of the silent room. It was a voice that commanded attention without begging for it. "The traffic on the bridge was worse than the projections," he continued, reaching out to take my trembling hands in his. His palms were warm and dry, steadying me. "Are you all right?" I looked up at him, feeling the air rush back into my lungs. "I am now," I whispered. Elias looked down at me, his eyes searching my face for damage. He saw the stress lines, the fear I was trying to hide, and his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of rage that promised retribution, before he smoothed it back into tenderness. He leaned down and kissed me on the forehead. It was not a quick peck. It was a deliberate, lingering kiss. It was a claim. It was a seal of protection. He held his lips against my skin for 3 seconds, long enough for the entire room to register the intimacy, the familiarity, the absolute possession. When he pulled back, he kept his hand on the back of my neck, his thumb stroking my skin soothingly. The silence broke. It started as a murmur, a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards. "Is that?" "It is. Oh my God. It is." "That is Elias Blackwood. The Blackwood Industries guy? The billionaire? What is he doing here? Did you see how he looked at her? Wait, is he with Kara?" The whispers grew louder, turning into a frantic buzz of speculation and shock. The name Blackwood rippled through the room like a shockwave. I saw faces changing. I saw the sneers dissolving into fear. I saw Sarah Miller Vane drop her jaw. I saw Rick Halloway turn a pale, sickly shade of gray. They were doing the math. They were realizing that the woman they had just spent the last hour ostracizing, the woman they had labeled a gold digger and a failure, was standing in the arms of a man who could buy and sell their entire lives before his morning coffee. On the stage, Julian seemed to snap out of his trance. He realized he was losing the room. The spotlight was no longer on him. It was on the couple standing in the shadows of the pillar. His narcissism, threatened by the sudden shift in gravity, kicked into overdrive. He needed to reclaim the narrative. He needed to be part of this. He adjusted his tie, plastered a shaky, ingratiating smile on his face, and practically jumped off the stage. He moved toward us with a quick, eager walk, his hands outstretched, desperate to make contact. "Mr. Blackwood," Julian called out, his voice cracking slightly before he corrected it to a smoother, deeper tone. "Mr. Elias Blackwood, I do not believe it." Elias did not turn around. He kept his eyes on me, adjusting the strap of my dress that had slipped slightly. Julian reached us, panting slightly from his haste. He stopped 3 feet away, effectively forcing his way into our circle. The sycophants, Rick, Beatrice, and the others, crowded behind him, eager to be in the proximity of true power. "This is an incredible honor," Julian gushed, thrusting his right hand forward aggressively. "I am Julian Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics. I have followed your work on the Transcontinental Pipeline for years. Your strategy on the merger with Tokyo Energy was simply visionary. Truly." He stood there, his hand hanging in the air. Elias slowly, very slowly, turned his head. He did not turn his body. He kept his shoulder angled toward me, protecting me. He just turned his head to look at the man who had interrupted him. Elias looked at Julian's hand. He stared at it for a full 5 seconds. The silence in the room became agonizing. It was thick enough to choke on. Every person in the room was watching that hand. It was suspended in the air, trembling slightly now. A rejected offering. Then, Elias raised his eyes to Julian's face. I had seen Elias angry. I had seen him frustrated, but I had never seen him look at a human being the way he looked at Julian Sterling. It was not hatred. Hatred implies that the other person matters. Hatred implies an equal. This was something far worse. It was the look a scientist gives to a bacteria culture in a petri dish. It was a look of cold, dispassionate scientific curiosity mixed with mild revulsion. It was the look you give to something you are about to scrape off your shoe. "You are the keynote speaker," Elias said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a flat, icy neutrality. "Yes, yes, I am," Julian beamed, mistaking the acknowledgement for interest. He dropped his hand, realizing the handshake was not going to happen, and tried to wipe his palm casually on his trousers. "I was just sharing some lessons on resilience, on building an empire from the ground up. Like you, sir, we are cut from the same cloth. You and I, self-made men." He laughed, a nervous, braying sound. "I would love to pick your brain sometime. Maybe grab a drink? I think Sterling Dynamics and Blackwood Industries could have some very interesting synergies." Elias tilted his head slightly to the side. "Synergies," he repeated. The word sounded ridiculous coming from his mouth, like he was tasting spoiled milk. "Exactly," Julian nodded vigorously, sweating now. "We are moving into the renewable sector. I know you are looking for partners in the Northeast. I think if you looked at our portfolio—" "I have looked at your portfolio," Elias interrupted. Julian froze. His eyes lit up with hope. "You have?" "My acquisitions team briefed me this morning," Elias said. He turned his body fully toward Julian now, his height giving him a significant advantage. He loomed over my ex-husband, casting him in shadow. "They tell me you enjoy telling stories. Mr. Sterling," Julian blinked, confused. "Stories? Well, I mean, marketing is all about the narrative, right? You have to sell the dream." "I am not talking about marketing," Elias said softly. "I am talking about the story you were telling when I walked in. The one about the anchor. The one about the debt." The color drained from Julian's face. He looked from Elias to me, and then back to Elias. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The connection. The reason Elias Blackwood was at a reunion for a mid-tier private school in upstate New York. Julian stammered. "That was just a metaphor. A speech. You know how it is. You have to dramatize things for the audience." "Is that what you call it?" Elias asked. He took a step forward. Julian took a step back. "Dramatization?" Elias reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The entire room flinched. As if expecting a weapon, Julian actually raised his hands defensively, but Elias simply pulled out a pair of rimless glasses and slid them onto his nose. The gesture was intellectual, precise, and terrifyingly calm. He then produced a folded document from the same pocket. "I found your speech very moving," Elias said, unfolding the paper with a crisp snap, "especially the part about the car, the 1967 Mustang." Julian swallowed hard. Adam's apple bobbed. "Mr. Blackwood, really, this is not the place." "I agree," Elias said. "The place for fiction is a library. This is a reunion, a place for remembering the truth." He looked over the top of his glasses at the crowd, his voice projecting clearly. "My wife," he said, and the word wife landed like a gavel. "Kara Windermere is a woman of exceptional talent and integrity. She is also incredibly private. She does not brag. She does not complain. So she would never tell you that the man standing before you is a liar." The crowd gasped. Beatrice let out a little squeak of indignation. "But I am not private," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "And I have a very low tolerance for liars." He looked back at Julian, who was now trembling visibly. "You offered to shake my hand." "Mr. Sterling," Elias said. "You said it was an honor. You said we are cut from the same cloth." Elias paused, letting the silence stretch until it was screaming. "Do not insult me," Elias whispered. "We are not the same. I build things. You steal them." He turned his back on Julian, dismissing him completely, and looked at me. The warmth returned to his eyes instantly, as if he had just switched off a freezing machine. "Are you ready?" he asked me. "Ready for what?" I breathed, my head spinning. "To correct the record," Elias said. He held out his hand to his assistant, who had materialized from the shadows near the entrance. A sharp, efficient woman holding a briefcase. She handed him a thick file. Elias took the file. He weighed it in his hand. Then he looked at the tech crew in the back of the room. "Cut his microphone," Elias ordered. The sound guy, terrified and awestruck, scrambled to obey. The feedback from the speakers died instantly. "And connect mine," Elias said, tapping a small lapel pin I hadn't noticed before. His voice boomed through the ballroom, clear, crisp, and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elias said, addressing the room, "I apologize for interrupting the festivities, but it seems you have been given some misinformation tonight, and since my wife is too polite to correct it, and Mr. Sterling is too delusional to admit it, I thought I would bring some receipts." He held up the file. "Shall we begin?" The room was paralyzed. Julian looked like he was about to vomit. Beatrice was backing away, trying to distance herself from the blast zone. I looked at Elias, at his strong profile, at the way he commanded the room with effortless power. I had spent 10 years feeling small. I had spent 10 years feeling like I had no voice. But tonight, the Titan had arrived. And he had brought the thunder. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not need to. In a room filled with people who measured power by the volume of a shout, Elias wielded silence like a scalpel. He stood in the center of the ballroom, the file folder held loosely in his left hand, looking at Julian Sterling not with anger, but with the weary patience of an adult dealing with a particularly slow child. "I know who you are, Julian," Elias began. His voice was a low, smooth baritone that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. "I do not mean the persona you just presented on stage. I do not mean the philanthropist or the visionary. I mean the entity currently listed as the primary liability in the risk assessment reports of 3 major Manhattan banks." Julian laughed, but it was a wet, strangulated sound. "I do not know what you are talking about, Mr. Blackwood. Surely you are not listening to rumors. Business is complex. There are always rumors." "I do not listen to rumors," Elias corrected him gently. "I read ledgers, and I read the due diligence report on a project called Skyline." The blood drained from Julian's face so fast it looked like a magic trick. One moment he was flushed with the exertion of his performance. The next, he was as gray as the ash of a dead fire. "Skyline," Elias repeated, tasting the word. "An ambitious proposal, a vertical farming initiative integrated into luxury housing, very trendy, very sustainable. The only problem, of course, is that it does not exist." A murmur rippled through the crowd. I saw Greg Thorne, the lawyer who had mocked me earlier, frown and lean forward. "It is in development," Julian protested, his voice pitching up an octave. "We are in the early stages. We have investors." "You had investors," Elias corrected, "until they realized that the $35 million they fronted you was not going to research and development. It was going to offshore accounts in the Caymans and a very impressive personal real estate portfolio in the Hamptons." The number hung in the air. $35 million. The crowd gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sounded like a vacuum sealing. This was not just gossip. This was an accusation of fraud. "That is a lie," Julian shouted. Taking a step forward, his hands balled into fists. "That is libel. I will sue you. You cannot just walk in here and accuse me of—" "I am not accusing you," Elias interrupted, opening the file folder with a crisp, decisive snap. He pulled out a sheet of paper, densely packed with numbers. "I am reading the forensic accounting report dated January 15th, 2026. It details a wire transfer of $2 million from the Skyline Operating Fund to a private account under the name JS Holdings on December 3rd. Would you like me to read the account number? Or perhaps the routing number?" Julian froze. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish thrown onto a dock, gasping, thrashing, and suffocating. "It is a misunderstanding," Julian rasped, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "We are restructuring. It is a temporary allocation of assets. It is standard practice. It is embezzlement, Elias said. The word was flat, hard, and final. He handed the paper to his assistant, who stood like a statue beside him, and pulled out another document. But let us leave the present for a moment, Elias said, taking a step closer to Julian. Let us go back to the touching story you just told, the one about the car, the 1967 Mustang, the sacrifice. Elias looked over his glasses at the audience. It was a beautiful story. It moved people to tears. I saw them. He turned back to Julian. It is a shame that the audit trail from 2016 tells a different story. Elias held up a bank statement. It was enlarged, clearly a photocopy of an official record. This is the transaction record for the settlement of your gambling debt, which, by the way, was $42,000, not $35,000. Inflation, I suppose, Elias drawled dryly. And the source of the funds was not a car dealership. It was a joint savings account at Chase Bank. He paused, letting the suspense build. Specifically, Elias continued, his eyes locking onto Julian's. It was a transfer from the sub-savings account labeled Kara's Inheritance, funds that were bequeathed to her by her grandmother, funds that were accessed without her signature using a forged withdrawal slip. The room went dead silent. The sympathy that had existed for Julian evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, horrified shock. Stealing from a wife was one thing. Stealing a dead grandmother's inheritance and then claiming you were the hero who made the sacrifice? That was a level of depravity that even this room of social climbers could not stomach. I felt a surge of heat in my chest. It was not anger anymore. It was power. For 10 years, I had carried the shame of that financial ruin. I had let him tell people I was bad with money. I had let him paint me as irresponsible. And here was the proof, held in the steady hand of my husband, visible to the world. Elias turned to me. Kara? He did not tell me what to do. He just opened the door. I took a breath. The air felt cleaner than it had all night. I stepped away from the pillar. I did not tremble. My legs felt like steel columns. I walked past Elias, moving until I was standing face to face with Julian. He looked at me, his eyes darting frantically, begging me with a silent desperation to stop, to show mercy. But I looked at him and realized that mercy for a predator is just permission to bite again. And the graduation project, I said. My voice was clear. It did not shake. The one you said you built for me? The one you claimed you stayed up all night to finish because I was having a breakdown? Julian licked his lips. Kara, please, don't do this. We can talk about this in private. We are done talking in private, I said. We are doing this in public. Julian, just like you wanted. I turned to the crowd. I saw Sarah. I saw Rick. I saw the people who had sneered at me. The final model for the Oakhaven senior thesis in 2015, I stated. If you go to the archives in the basement of the library, pull box number 412, inside, you will find the original blueprints. I looked back at Julian. You always forgot the details. Julian, you forgot that the professor required us to sign our work in ink on the structural base before we sealed the model. My signature is there, in blue ink, dated 3 days before the deadline. I took a step closer to him. And you know what else is there? The structural load calculations, in my handwriting, because you could not do the math. You never could. Julian flinched as if I had struck him. That is ancient history. Who cares about a school project? You did, Elias interjected smoothly. Enough to lie about it 10 minutes ago. Elias signaled to his assistant again. This time, she handed him a blue folder. It was stamped with the seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. But since Mr. Sterling thinks school projects are irrelevant, Elias said, let us discuss something more current. Intellectual property. Julian's eyes widened until the whites showed all around the irises. No, he whispered. You cannot have that. Windermere and Associates holds a patent for a specific type of kinetic glass paneling used in high-efficiency skyscrapers. Elias said, tapping the folder. Patent number 89244, registered by Kara Windermere in 2024. Elias pulled out a brochure, a glossy marketing pamphlet for Sterling Dynamics. This is the brochure for your new, revolutionary facade system, Elias said. It is a direct copy. You did not even change the schematics. You just slapped your logo over my wife's work. He tossed the brochure onto the floor at Julian's feet. It landed with a soft slap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. That is patent infringement, Julian, Elias said. And since you are currently under contract with the city using stolen technology, that is also fraud. Again, the crowd was moving now. They were physically recoiling from Julian. The circle around him expanded, leaving him isolated in the center of the floor. Beatrice, his better half, had quietly unhooked her arm from his. I saw her slide the massive diamond ring off her finger and drop it into her clutch. Stepping back into the shadow of a tall plant, Rick Halloway was staring at his shoes, pretending he had never met Julian in his life. Julian looked around, realizing he was alone. The adoration was gone. The respect was gone. He was naked, stripped of every lie he had used to cover his mediocrity. "You are trying to ruin me," Julian stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Elias. "This is a hostile attack. You are just a bully with a checkbook." Elias smiled. It was a terrifying smile. It was the smile of a wolf who has cornered a rabbit and finds the rabbit's defiance amusing. "A bully?" Elias mused. "No, I am a businessman, and as a businessman, I look for opportunities." He handed the file back to his assistant and dusted off his hands, as if he had touched something dirty. "You see, Julian," Elias said, his voice dropping to a conversational, almost friendly tone. "When I saw the risk assessment for Sterling Dynamics, I saw a company in distress, a company with massive debt, fraudulent assets, and a CEO who spends more time planning reunion speeches than managing his cash flow." Elias took a step closer, towering over Julian. "So, I made a call," Elias said. "While you were giving your speech, while you were making fun of my wife, I was on the phone with your primary lender, the First National Bank of Oakhaven." Julian's knees buckled slightly. "What?" "They were very nervous about your liquidity," Elias explained. $35 million in debt is a lot of exposure for a regional bank. They were happy to offload the risk. Elias leaned in, his face inches from Julian's. "I bought your debt, Julian." The words hung there, heavy and absolute. "I bought all of it," Elias whispered. "The Skyline loan, the operating lines of credit, even the mortgage on your office building. Blackwood Industries is now the sole holder of every dime you owe." Julian gasped. "You cannot do that." "I just did," Elias said. "The transfer was confirmed 4 minutes ago." He straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. "So, here is the new reality," Elias announced, his voice projecting to the back of the room. "You do not answer to a board of directors anymore. You do not answer to the bank. You answer to me." He looked at Julian with a look of absolute disdain. "And as your new creditor, I am calling in the loan, immediately." "I cannot pay that," Julian shrieked. "I do not have $35 million liquid. You know I don't." "Then I suppose we will have to liquidate your assets," Elias said calmly. "The company, the house in the Hamptons, the car, and that ring your fiancé just took off." Julian looked around wildly for Beatrice, but she was gone. She had vanished into the crowd. "Please," Julian whimpered. The arrogance was completely gone now. He was small. He was pathetic. He was begging. "Mr. Blackwood, Elias, please, do not do this. This is my life. I worked so hard." "You worked hard at lying," Elias said. "Now you can work hard at paying me back." Elias turned to me. "Kara," he said, and his voice softened. "Is there anything else you would like to add before we conclude this meeting?" I looked at Julian. He was slumped, his shoulders hunched, tears of panic streaming down his face. He looked nothing like the monster who had haunted my dreams for a decade. He looked like exactly what he was, a fraud who had finally run out of other people's money. "No," I said quietly. "I think the math speaks for itself." Elias nodded. "Then we are done here." He offered me his arm. "Shall we go get some dinner? I believe you mentioned you were hungry." "Yes," I said, slipping my arm through his. "I am starving." We turned our backs on Julian Sterling, leaving him standing in the ruin of his own making, and began to walk toward the exit. The crowd parted for us again. But this time, the silence was not one of shock. It was one of awe, and as we passed Rick Halloway, I saw him flinch. We were walking out, and we were leaving the ashes behind us. The silence that followed Elias's declaration was not the heavy, respectful silence of a church, nor was it the terrified silence of a tomb. It was the vibrating, high-frequency silence of a bomb that had just detonated but had not yet hit the shockwave phase. The reality of what had just happened hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Julian Sterling, the golden boy, the keynote speaker, the man who had spent the last hour meticulously constructing a monument to his own greatness, had just been stripped down to the rotting wood frame beneath the gold paint. For a moment, Julian stood frozen. His mouth hung open, a rictus of shock, his eyes darting back and forth between Elias and the floor as if trying to find a trapdoor. He looked at the faces of his audience, the people who had been applauding him moments ago, and saw the one thing a narcissist cannot survive: contempt. They were not looking at him with pity anymore. They were looking at him like he was a contagion. And then, he snapped. It was not a gradual crumbling. It was a violent, jagged fracture. The carefully curated persona of the calm, benevolent billionaire disintegrated, and the raw, ugly creature beneath clawed its way to the surface. His face, usually so composed, contorted into a mask of pure, red-faced fury. A vein in his temple began to throb visibly, pulsing with the frantic rhythm of his collapsing world. "No," Julian whispered, the words scraping out of his throat like sandpaper. Then he screamed, a sound that tore through the elegance of the ballroom like a shrapnel blast. "No, this is a setup." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging. You did this. You planned this." He looked around the room, spinning in a frantic circle, addressing the crowd that was already backing away from him. "Do you not see what is happening here? She is trying to humiliate me. She brought him here to destroy me because she is jealous. She could not stand that I made it. She could not stand that I won." "Julian," I said, my voice calm. "Nobody won. You just got caught." "Shut up," he shrieked, spit flying from his lips. He turned back to Elias, his chest heaving. "And you think you can just walk in here and buy my life? You think you are better than me? You are nothing. You are just a wallet, a walking checkbook." Julian's eyes locked onto me again, and the malice in them was terrifying. It was the look of a man who knows he is drowning and has decided that his only remaining goal is to drag someone else down into the black water with him. "You slept with him," Julian roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "That is it, isn't it? You could not make it as an architect, so you found the richest man in New York and spread your legs. You whored yourself out to get revenge on me." The vulgarity of the accusation hit the room like a physical slap. Several people gasped. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. The illusion of the aggrieved, saintly ex-husband was gone, replaced by the reality of a misogynistic abuser who had finally lost his filter. "You are a gold digger, Kara," he shouted, stepping toward me. "That is all you ever were. You leached off me, and now you are leeching off him. You are a parasite." He lunged. It happened in a blur. Julian, fueled by the adrenaline of total humiliation, charged across the few feet of marble separating us. His hands were reaching for me, his fingers hooked into claws, his face twisted into a snarl of violence. I did not have time to flinch. I did not have time to step back. But I did not have to. Elias moved. He did not run. He did not shout. He simply took one single, decisive step forward, placing his body directly between me and the onrushing storm. He did not raise his fists. He did not assume a fighting stance. He just stood there, 6 feet and 3 inches of immovable granite. He looked down at Julian with eyes that were no longer human. They were the cold, dead eyes of a predator looking at prey that had made a fatal miscalculation. Julian skidded to a halt. He stopped inches from Elias's chest, the momentum of his rage crashing against the wall of Elias's absolute stillness. Elias tilted his head down slightly. He did not blink. He did not breathe hard. He projected an aura of violence so contained, so disciplined, and so lethal that it was infinitely more terrifying than Julian's flailing temper. "Take one more step," Elias said. His voice was a whisper, but it was the kind of whisper that stops a heart. "Please, give me a reason." Julian froze. His hands, which had been raised to grab me, hovered in the air, trembling violently. He looked up at Elias, and for the first time, he saw the physical reality of the situation. He saw the breadth of Elias's shoulders. He saw the tension in Elias's jaw. He saw the promise of immediate, devastating consequences. The bully in Julian withered, the rage evaporated, leaving behind only fear. He stumbled back, his shoes squeaking on the polished floor, his breath coming in short, terrified gasps. "I was just," Julian stammered, holding his hands up in surrender. "I am upset. You have to understand. I am under a lot of stress." Elias did not move. He kept his eyes locked on Julian's throat, ensuring the threat was neutralized from behind the safety of Elias's shoulder. I watched the final piece of Julian's life fall away. Beatrice was standing near the edge of the circle, looking at the scene with wide, horrified eyes. She looked at Julian, sweaty, screaming, terrified, and then she looked at Elias. Elias, without turning his head, flicked his gaze toward Beatrice for a fraction of a second. He looked at the massive diamond heart on her finger, raised one eyebrow, and gave a short, dismissive sniff. It was a microscopic gesture, but it conveyed volumes. It said, "Glass." Beatrice looked down at her ring. Then she looked at Julian, the man who was now $35 million in debt and about to lose everything. The calculation in her eyes was instant and brutal. She was a survivor, just like the rest of them. Slowly, deliberately, Beatrice twisted the ring off her finger. She did not throw it at him. That would have been too dramatic. She simply dropped it into her champagne glass. It hit the liquid with a dull plink that sounded nothing like a heavy diamond hitting crystal. It sounded like plastic. She set the glass on a passing waiter's tray, turned on her heel, and walked toward the exit without looking back. "Beatrice?" Julian called out, his voice cracking. "Bea, where are you going?" She did not answer. She disappeared into the night, taking her youth and her beauty with her, leaving him with nothing but his debt. Julian spun around, looking for an ally, looking for anyone who would help him hold up the sky that was falling on his head. "Rick," he shouted, spotting his best friend near the bar. "Rick, tell them about the company. Tell them about the contracts. You saw the papers." Rick Halloway, the man who had told me I should be ashamed of myself 20 minutes ago, looked at Julian. He looked at the desperate, sweating man pleading for validation. Then he looked at Elias Blackwood, the billionaire who now owned Julian's mortgage. Rick picked up his drink, turned his back on Julian, and started a conversation with the person next to him about the weather. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it broke the dam. "I remember," a voice called out from the crowd. It was Greg Thorne. "Actually, now that I think about it, Kara did do all the work on that final project. I saw her in the studio at 4 a.m. "Yeah," another voice chimed in. "Sarah. And I remember he used to make her pay for all the groceries. He never had his wallet." He borrowed $500 from me in 2012 and never paid it back, someone else shouted. He is a fraud. Liar. The mob had turned. The same people who had been feeding on my reputation were now devouring him. It was sickening in its hypocrisy. But it was also inevitable. They were sharks, and they smelled blood in the water. They did not care about truth. They cared about hierarchy, and Julian was no longer at the top. Julian stood in the center of the room, turning in slow, jerky circles as the accusations rained down on him. He covered his ears with his hands. Stop it! Stop lying! I am Julian Sterling. I am a success. You are all jealous. You are all nothing. He was sobbing now, ugly, heaving sobs of self-pity. He looked reduced, shrunken, as if the air had been let out of him. Elias stepped aside. He did not block me anymore. He moved to the left, giving me a clear path to the man who had tormented me for a decade. Kara, Elias said softly, he is all yours. I stepped forward. The crowd quieted down, eager for the finale. They wanted to see the execution, but I was not an executioner. I was just a woman who was finally done. I walked until I was 2 feet away from Julian. He looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, his face streaked with tears and snot. He looked pathetic. He looked small. Kara, he whispered, his voice trembling. Kara, please, help me. Tell them. Tell them we had good times. Tell them I loved you. He reached out a hand to touch my dress. I did not recoil. I simply looked at his hand, and he let it drop. Knowing he no longer had the right to touch me, I looked him in the eye, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, no hate. Just a profound, heavy pity for a man who had spent his whole life building a castle out of smoke. I cannot help you. Julian, I said. My voice was low, steady, and heard by everyone in the room. Because the Julian Sterling you want me to defend does not exist. He never did. Julian flinched. You spent 10 years telling everyone that I was the anchor dragging you down. I continued. But the truth is, I was the only thing keeping you afloat. I was the one who fixed your mistakes. I was the one who paid your bills. I was the one who gave you the illusion of competence. I leaned in closer, so he could see the truth in my eyes. You were never a victim, Julian. You were never a martyr. You were just a lucky con artist who found a woman willing to set herself on fire to keep you warm. But you forgot one thing. What? He breathed, staring at me. You forgot that eventually, the fire goes out, I said, and when the smoke clears, everyone can see that you are just a small man standing in the ashes. I straightened up and looked down at him. Your luck just ran out. Julian, tonight is not a tragedy. It is an audit. And you came up short. Julian stared at me, his mouth working silently. He had no comeback. He had no lie left to tell. The mirror had been held up, and he could not survive the reflection. Mr. Blackwood? A deep voice rumbled from the entrance. We all turned. The head of hotel security, accompanied by 2 large uniformed guards, was standing there. They looked serious. They looked efficient. Elias nodded to them. This gentleman is disturbing the peace, Elias said, gesturing casually to Julian. And I believe he is trespassing at a private event for Oakhaven alumni. I am an alumnus, Julian shouted, trying to regain some shred of dignity. I am the keynote speaker. Not anymore, Elias said. The security guards moved in. They did not handle him gently. One took each arm. Sir, you need to come with us, the lead guard said. Get your hands off me, Julian screamed, struggling as they hauled him toward the door. Do you know who I am? I am Julian Sterling. I am a CEO. You will hear from my lawyers. We can discuss that outside. Sir, the guard said. Dragging him backward, Julian dug his heels into the carpet, fighting like a child being taken to time out. He looked back at me, his eyes wide with panic. Kara, he screamed. Kara, do not let them do this. We are family. Kara. I watched him go. I watched the man who had dominated my life, who had made me question my own sanity, being dragged out of a ballroom by two bouncers like a common drunk. He passed the threshold of the double doors. He screamed one last obscenity, and then the doors swung shut, cutting off the sound of his voice. Silence returned to the ballroom. But this time, it was different. It was the silence of a fever breaking. It was the silence of fresh air rushing into a room that had been sealed for too long. I stood in the center of the empty space where he had been. I took a deep breath. My lungs expanded fully, without pain, without restriction. Elias walked over to me. He did not say a word. He just reached out and took my hand. I squeezed it back. The monster was gone. The nightmare was over. And for the first time in 10 years, the room belonged to me. The heavy thud of the double doors sealing Julian outside felt like the final punctuation mark at the end of a long, agonizing sentence. The ballroom, which had been a cauldron of noise and malice only an hour ago, was now submerged in a stunned, almost reverent silence. It was the kind of quiet that follows a natural disaster, where the survivors are just looking around, blinking, trying to understand how the landscape changed so quickly. I stood in the center of that silence, my hand still warm in Elias's grip. I felt light, physically light. It was as if a heavy, sodden coat I had been wearing for a decade had finally slipped off my shoulders and dissolved into the floorboards. I took a breath, and the air did not taste like judgment anymore. It tasted like recycled hotel air. Yes, but underneath that, it tasted like freedom. Then, the dam broke. It started with a nervous cough from the back of the room, and then the paralysis lifted. The crowd, realizing the show was over and the hierarchy had been violently restructured, began to move, but they did not move away from me this time. They moved toward me. It was a slow, hesitant tide of tuxedos and evening gowns. The faces that approached me were no longer twisted in sneers or masked with condescending pity. They were open, eager, and terrified. "Kara," a voice said. It was Sarah. She pushed through the front line, her face pale, her eyes wide with a frantic need to be absolved. "Kara, oh my God, I had no idea." She reached for my hand, but I kept it tucked in the crook of Elias's arm. "I mean, the things he said," Sarah stammered, her voice pitching up. "He was so convincing. We were all just duped. You have to believe me. If I had known he was stealing from you, from your grandmother's inheritance, I would never have spoken to him. I feel terrible." "It is okay, Sarah," I said. My voice was calm. It lacked the jagged edges of anger I had felt earlier. "No, it is not okay," she insisted, tears welling up in her eyes, tears that were mostly for herself. I suspected. We were friends. I should have asked. "We should grab coffee sometime, catch up properly. I would love to hear about your firm, Windermere and Associates, right? I heard you are doing the new library. That is amazing." I looked at her, 10 years ago. Her validation would have meant everything to me. I would have begged for this crumb of connection. But looking at her now, desperate to align herself with the winner, I realized I felt nothing, not hatred, not forgiveness, just a profound, neutral distance. "We will see," I said politely, using the phrase that means no in every language. Then came Rick. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He stopped 3 feet away, unable to look Elias in the eye. "Kara," he said, staring at his shoes. "I owe you an apology. The things I said earlier, about the affair, about the money. I was repeating lies. I should have known better." "You should have," I agreed simply. He flinched. "I hope you can forgive me. Julian has a way of twisting things." "He does," I said. "But you chose to listen." I looked around at the circle of faces. Greg, Emily, the others. They were all nodding, all murmuring their regrets, all rewriting their own internal narratives to explain why they had treated me like a pariah for the last 3 hours. "He tricked us. We didn't know." You are so brave. Kara, you are so strong. I realized then that I did not need their apologies. Their opinions had been the bars of my cage. But the cage was open now. I did not need them to like me. I did not need them to understand me. I just needed them to be irrelevant. And they were. Elias squeezed my hand, sensing my fatigue. He stepped forward slightly, his presence acting as a gentle but firm barrier between me and the crowd. "My wife has had a long evening," Elias announced. His voice was polite but final. "And I believe we have taken up enough of your time." He looked down at me, ignoring the sea of faces clamoring for his attention. The hard titanium look he had worn while dismantling Julian was gone. His eyes were soft, dark, and filled with a question. "Do you want to stay?" he asked. "We can stay. We can dance. We can make them watch you shine for another hour if you want." I looked around the grand ballroom. I looked at the chandeliers that cost more than my first apartment. I looked at the champagne flutes and the fake smiles. I looked at the stage where Julian had tried to break my spirit and had ruined his own credibility instead. I had come here to prove something. I had come to prove I was not broken, and I had done it. Staying any longer would just be vanity. "No," I said, a genuine smile touching my lips for the first time that night. "I do not want to dance. I want to go home. I am starving. You promised me dinner." Elias chuckled, a low, warm sound that vibrated against my side. "I did, and I know a very good Italian place that is still open. Let's go," I said. We turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide avenue for us. We walked past the bar, past the tables, past the spot where Julian had been dragged out. I did not look back. I did not wave. I simply walked out of the room and out of their lives. The lobby of the hotel was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the ballroom. We walked through the revolving doors and stepped out into the night air. It was raining slightly. The drops were cold and clean against my flushed skin. The city lights of New York reflected on the wet pavement, turning the street into a river of gold and neon. The valet was waiting with Elias's car, a sleek black sedan that looked like a shadow on wheels. He opened the door for me with a newfound respect that bordered on fear. I slid into the leather seat, the smell of the interior wrapping around me like a cocoon. Elias got in the driver's side. He started the engine. The low purr of the motor, the only sound in the enclosed space. He pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic, leaving the Grand Oakhaven fading in the rearview mirror. I watched the hotel disappear. The building that held so much of my trauma, so much of my fear, shrank until it was just another light in the skyline. And then, without warning, the tears came. They did not start as a trickle. They came all at once, a sudden, overwhelming flood that shook my entire body. I covered my face with my hands, gasping for breath, sobbing so hard that my chest ached. It was not sadness. It was not pain. It was release. It was the physical sensation of 10 years of tension leaving my body. It was the adrenaline crash. It was the realization that the monster under my bed was gone, and he was never coming back. I had carried a stone on my chest for a decade, terrified that if I moved, it would crush me. Tonight, I had stood up, and the stone had rolled away. Elias did not say a word. He did not tell me to stop crying. He did not ask what was wrong. He knew. He simply reached across the console and took my hand. He interlaced his fingers with mine, holding on tight, anchoring me to the earth while I weathered the storm. He drove with one hand, navigating the city streets with a calm competence, while his other hand told me everything I needed to know. I am here. You are safe. You are free. I cried until there were no tears left. I cried until I felt hollowed out and scrubbed clean. Then, I took a deep, shuddering breath and wiped my face. "Better?" Elias asked softly, his eyes still on the road. "Yes," I whispered, my voice raspy. "Much better." He lifted my hand and kissed the knuckles. "You were incredible tonight. Kara, I have never seen anyone stand that tall. I had help, I said, looking at him. You didn't need it, Elias said. You had him beat the moment you walked in the door. I just sped up the paperwork. I laughed, a weak, watery sound, but it felt real. $35 million. Elias? Did you really buy his debt? Every cent, Elias said, a wicked glint in his eye. It was a good investment. The tax write-off alone will be significant. Plus, I intend to liquidate his assets with extreme prejudice. I think I will turn his office building into a shelter for victims of domestic financial abuse. It seems poetic. I leaned my head back against the seat and watched the city blur by. For the first time in my life, the future did not look like a struggle. It looked like an open road. The next morning, the sun broke over Manhattan with a clarity that felt symbolic. I sat at my kitchen island, a cup of coffee in my hand, reading the news on my tablet. The headlines were not subtle. Billionaire Blackwood acquires Sterling Dynamics in hostile takeover. Julian Sterling ousted amid fraud allegations. The fall of a tech darling. Inside the financial scandal of the year. The articles were brutal. They detailed the debt, the fake Skyline project, the patent infringement. There were photos of Julian being escorted out of the hotel by security, looking disheveled and frantic. His reputation was not just damaged, it was incinerated. There was no coming back from this. He would spend the next 10 years in courtrooms and bankruptcy hearings. But buried in the business section, there was another article, smaller, but infinitely more important. Windermere Associates secures patent rights, confirms lead on city waterfront project. It spoke of my work, my designs, my integrity. It mentioned that the technology Julian had tried to steal was rightfully mine. I put the tablet down. I did not feel gloating joy. I just felt a quiet sense of order being restored. The universe had rebalanced itself. I finished my coffee, dressed in a sharp navy blazer and jeans, and drove to the site of my newest project. It was the Brooklyn Community Library, the one I had designed from the ground up. It was nearing completion. The structure was a soaring wave of glass and sustainable timber. Designed to let light flood into the reading rooms, it was beautiful, it was functional, and it was mine. I put on my hard hat and walked through the skeletal structure of the main atrium. The sunlight was pouring in through the steel beams, casting long geometric shadows on the concrete floor. The air smelled of sawdust and progress. I walked to the central pillar, where the commemorative plaque was going to be mounted. The foreman was there, holding a clipboard. "Ms. Windermere," he said, nodding respectfully, "we are ready for the final sign-off on the glass installation." "Thank you, Mike," I said. He handed me the blueprints. I unrolled them on a makeshift table made of plywood. I looked at the complex lines, the calculations, the vision that had started in my head and was now becoming reality. I took a pen from my pocket. 10 years ago, I had signed a model that a man took credit for. I had hidden my name. I had made myself small so he could feel big. Today, I uncapped the pen. I wrote my signature in the bottom corner of the document. Kara Windermere, lead architect. The ink was dark and permanent. I looked up at the steel beams rising into the blue sky. I was not Julian Sterling's ex-wife anymore. I was not a victim. I was not a survivor. I was the architect of my own life. The wind blew through the open frame of the building, ruffling my hair. It was cold, but I did not shiver. I turned my face to the sun and closed my eyes, feeling the warmth on my skin. I was ready to build. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment below telling me which country or city you are listening from. Let's connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the Sweet Rose Drama channel, like the video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us.